All right, you all have a wonderful session.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Aisha. Just before we start, as moderator, will both of you guys be presenting or sharing slides today during your presentations?
I will be.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll go ahead and make you a co-host. So then you'll be able to share your screen. And then again, as you also can admit people, so if you see new names that you recognize pop up in the waiting room, just go ahead and admit them into the panel.
All right, perfect. Jesse, are you the discussant?
Yes, yes.
Is it just me?
I believe there are other presenters I saw on the list, but I don't know where they are.
Yeah, that's okay. It's a party, it sounds like.
I know Naomi will not be joining us today, but I have not heard from Tierra as of yet. Okay, I am ready whenever you all are.
Aisha, are you starting?
Yes, of course. We can go ahead. I resumed the recording, so this panel will be recorded. So again, I'm pretty sure I gave you the capabilities to share your screen. So whenever you want to start your presentation, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks for having me. My name is Kendrick Roberson, and I'm a specialist in US politics, and my research is grounded in the intersection between racialized politics and American political development. And so for my research that I'm presenting today, I investigate how Black home ownership is impacted by the partisanship of judges in the state of New York. And I support my New York findings by employing a nationwide analysis of changing Black home ownership as well. And so I use a theory of pernicious racism and a quantitative analysis to determine that there is a penalty on or a penalty of political parties on Black home ownership in America. Moreover, the penalty varies depending on the opportunity structure for institutional racism with respect to Black home ownership. And I believe this research is important for the field of political science because it provides an avenue to challenge the assumed race neutrality of American institutions. All right, so let me go on to the next slide here. So briefly, right, here's the road we're going to take today. I'm going to provide a light introduction, dive into the theory and research design, provide the main results, and then open up for discussion. The whole thing will be a little bit less than 15 minutes. All right, so going with our introduction. So I want to start by discussing the phenomena of the Black home ownership penalty across the entire United States, right? Home ownership across all 50 states has declined between 2010 and 2017. But Black home ownership has declined much more precipitously. Here, Black home ownership is shown by this large yellow bar that you're seeing here, right? This is Black home ownership. And while this penalty is already an issue when analyzed across all states, it gets more interesting when we split the data by states that are controlled by the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. So let's check that out. So notice here how the graph has changed. When you look at just the Democrat-controlled states in the US, you see that home ownership declines among Black families is more aligned with the overall declines in these states, right? There still appears to be somewhat of a penalty, but it's far less prominent than what we see in Republican states. So now looking at Republican states, right, this is what the penalty looks like. Notice that declines in Black home ownership in Republican states are over double that of all households and over 3 times that of white families, right? A similar pattern is found in states that are not firmly in control by one of the major 2 parties, and I'll show you that here. These are mixed states, right? And you can see here that mixed states have a penalty on Black home ownership that is similar to Republican states and in some ways relatively worse. Just looking at this again, the Black folks represented by this yellow bar here. So here's a direct question we're going to be talking through today, right? What explains the varying penalty on Black home ownership across states? My argument is that a state's foreclosure laws, as well as the political leanings of the state's judiciary, create varying opportunities for institutional racism to occur. You see, for about half of the states in America, to foreclose on a home, a lender must go through the courts and stand before a judge. These are called judicial foreclosure states. Now, for the other half of the states, lenders can foreclose on a home through an out-of-court process, which makes foreclosing on homes much less expensive. I argue that it is through these developed opportunity structures that Black home ownership is actually penalized, right? More acutely, I'm claiming that Black folks are losing their homes at greater rates where judiciaries are not operating as a roadblock that demands equitable foreclosures. So here's my, my bluff chart or my bottom line up front chart. All right, what I have found is in my analysis is that in areas where foreclosures must go through judges and those judges lean Democrat, there is no penalty on Black home ownership. This is evidenced by my analysis on New York as well as my nationwide data. All right, in all other areas, there is a significant penalty on Black home ownership. Right? And we'll get more into how that happens very, very soon. So let's talk a little bit about the theory behind this work. So I put forth a theory of pernicious racism, right, to ground this analysis. And my theoretical argument is that the resistance to pernicious racism against Black Americans is greatest in states that are controlled by the Democratic Party. And what I mean by pernicious racism is that America passed a lot of anti-discrimination laws. And we have, as a society, condemned discriminatory behavior on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, and a handful of other reasons. So overt racism has declined significantly by and large over the last 6 decades. However, while overt racism may be largely on the decline, there still remains a high level of racism that is not easily seen, but is very harmful, which I call pernicious racism. And the intentionality of this form of racism differentiates pernicious racism from other prominent types, such as symbolic, colorblind, and aversive racism. And my theory is simply that pernicious racism will not as easily flourish in Democrat-controlled states because the ideology of the Democratic Party has a much more hands-on approach to their anti-discrimination agenda than that of the Republican Party. Basically, my research highlights the role of political institutional setting on Black home ownership. And there has been surprisingly little written about the intersection of politics and Black home ownership. So we're going to get into that. And lastly, there are a couple more key points I want to address on this slide. First, it's important to note that the political affiliations of state judiciaries are aligned with the prevailing party control of the state, right? So in my national analysis, I use state party control as a proxy for the partisanship lean of the state's judiciary. This is important because, as I was stating earlier, studies have shown that lenders that provide mortgages across multiple states do not simply decide on some criteria and say, we're going to foreclose on anyone that meets this criteria. Anyone, for example, anyone that's 90 days delinquent, we're going to foreclose on them, right? They don't just go through and say that for anyone who meets that criteria. Instead, lenders are strategic about who they foreclose on. And they're strategic with utility maximization in mind. And part of that decision-making process on who to foreclose on is, what is the process for foreclosure in this state? And if I have to go before a judge, who is the judge and how might they decide? These lenders are going to operate within the institutional opportunity structure that they are provided. Going into to the research design here. So to gain insight on the validity of my theory, I first assess Black home ownership across judicial districts in the state of New York, right? For each of New York's 13 judicial districts, I have data on the home ownership of all races and ethnicities between 2010 and 2017. Further, I analyzed 221 trial court judges across New York's judicial districts that were elected in partisan elections and served between 2010 and 2017. This allows me to actually see how Black home ownership changes across judicial districts where there are Republican judges and Democrat judges. Right? And New York was a great place for this analysis because New York is a Democrat-controlled state that has judicial foreclosure laws. And at the state level, movements in Black home ownership in New York were more aligned with other races. All right, and so finally, to support my findings at the New York state level, I perform a national analysis of the changes in Black home ownership relative to other races and ethnicities. Again, in that analysis, the national analysis, I use the party control of state legislatures to proxy for the party control of state judiciaries. Right? And so for my methodology, I use OLS regression analysis to extract the direct impact of political institutional setting on Black home ownership. And I do have the OLS specification in the backup for use during discussion. So the hypotheses I want to review are listed here. I test whether Black people are better off in Democrat judicial states, such that these judiciaries provide greater protection of Black home ownership. And I hypothesize the same relationship at the national level, such that there will be a limited penalty on Black home ownership relative to other races in Democrat states that have judicial foreclosure laws. Having judicial foreclosure laws is extremely important in this hypothesis and in this analysis. So let's check out these results. So these are the results for the state of New York. All right. The significant line to see here is this bottom coefficient plot. All right. Year over year, Black home ownership experienced a penalty in New York judicial districts where Republican constituencies were picking their candidate. All right. In Democrat and mixed judicial districts, the penalty on Black home ownership was statistically indistinguishable from zero at the 95% level. And that's what we're seeing here, right? We're crossing over this zero barrier. Now, these plots suggest that the partisanship of the judiciary matters greatly for Black home ownership. Remember, these findings are for New York, which is already a deeply blue state. All right. And the next plot actually shows us what it looks like with national data. Right. So here are our national results in the form, again, of a coefficient plot. Right. And what this measures is the penalty on Black home ownership between 2010 and 2017, dependent on different groups of states. Right. So we're moving from the New York judiciaries, judicial districts, to now states, to individual states in the US. And so as you can see, there is a statistically significant penalty on Black home ownership in all of these groups of states, except one. This is the only one. Right. The bottom coefficient plot measures the Black penalty on home ownership in Democrat-controlled states that have judicial foreclosure laws. And as prefaced in the bluff chart, right, you'll see that this is the only group where the penalty on Black home ownership is not statistically different from zero at the 95% level, as it here crosses that zero bar. All right. This means that Democrat states that have judicial foreclosure laws, that their changes in Black home ownership are aligned with the changes in home ownership of other races and ethnicities, which is what you want, right? These plots provide great support to my New York findings, such that Democrat judiciaries act as a roadblock to pernicious racism when allowed to, right? And as we move to discussion, I'll put up a slide as a reminder for getting us thinking about the future. But since I have a little extra time here, I want to say that one thing you want to point out here is look at these Democrat states that are non-judicial states, right? These are states that are controlled by Democrats, but they, if a lender is to foreclose on a home, they do not have to go through the courts, right? And you see that there is a significant penalty here, right? And that should make sense. That lends credibility to this analysis, right? Because there are no roadblocks. Yeah, they might be controlled by Democrats, and yeah, Democrats might have an ideology that is more hands-on to fighting anti-discrimination or to fighting discrimination. But because the lenders don't have to go through the courts, there is no institutional roadblock. And so you will see that pernicious racism bear its head, and you will see a penalty on Black home ownership in even Democrat states that are controlled or that are also non-judicial foreclosure states. All right, and so as we come here to discussion, and I'll conclude here, right? One thing I want to just point out, and we'll leave this slide up as we go through discussion, but the political judicial structure of American states matter for Black home ownership, right? That's the biggest push that I'm trying to get through this analysis, is that, hey, when we look at judicial states and we look at the differences about who's in control of those judicial states or who's in control of those judicial districts, right? The courts really do matter. They're supposed to stand as a roadblock for discrimination, and depending on the person that's sitting in the seat, right? You see different outcomes. All right, and the implications of this will be wildly important, especially as we move into the near future, because the COVID-19 pandemic was something that hit all communities hard, but the Black community especially hard, right? And the foreclosure moratoriums have been lifted, right? And so as these lenders begin to figure out who they are going to target and where they are going to target for foreclosures, we should or will likely see a similar pattern as we saw after the Great Recession in the data that I presented here today. All right, and with that, I'll open it up. I'll open it up to you, Jesse.
Thank you so much, Kendrick. That was wonderful. So now, if there's anyone in the audience, if you have a question for Kendrick, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can place it in the chat and we will read it for you. And while you're thinking about your questions or comments, I will say, Kendrick, again, wonderful job. I believe this is a very important topic, and I do like the fact that you looked at it took the approach that you did to kind of look at it from the judicial influence on decisions that are made when it comes to foreclosures. I will say, I'm glad that you pointed out this issue of states that do not have judicial partisan elections for their judicial officials. That was a question I had, so I was glad to see that you pointed it out in your graph. And I have some more comments, but I want to give others an opportunity to kind of step in if they want to. I'm gonna say if not. Just a few things to highlight for you that I liked as I read your paper. 3 things that stood out to me. I like this idea, or the theme that kept coming to me was this idea of accessibility. And you're talking about it in terms of housing, but I was able to kind of translate it over into other areas such as, economics and jobs and education, which is the area that I worked in. So I saw a lot of similarities in this idea of what services or opportunities are accessible or available to not only the Black community, but other racial, historically marginalized groups. And so I like that we are looking at it kind of in these little particular areas, but noticing as I'm coming from a different discipline from yourself, I'm still noticing these kind of same issues arising. And so it's good to kind of see the different solutions that may work in one area, and if we can sort of translate them over into other spaces as well. Another idea that I thought was very strong from you was this strategy of pursuing foreclosures that the different companies will use, especially when they have offices or they have mortgages in various states, you know, and them sort of picking and choosing which areas they are going to either pursue it or let it go. And a lot of it hinges on whether or not that state has the laws that are advantageous to them. And so I do like that idea as well, because it shows us that they could take a different approach if they wanted to, but they choose not to because, again, it's more advantageous for them to, you know, beef up their profits if they're able to pursue these actions in the states that allow it. And then lastly, something I thoroughly enjoyed, and I would love for you to go a little bit deeper into explaining, is this top-down approach. And he can explain it better than me, but just from what I read, you know, most of the time when we're looking at issues, we do look at them from the ground up and sort of looking at them in the way of, okay, well, what are the homeowners doing? What are the communities doing? And we sort of give a pass to our elected officials who are sort of setting these laws and putting a lot of these things into action. And we don't hold them accountable sometimes for their actions, or we're just unaware that they have set certain things in place to make it difficult for homeownership to be an option, that's particularly for Black communities or other marginalized communities. So definitely, if you want to expound on that, I would love to hear more on why you decided to do it that way, and any benefits that you see from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull up this diagram, this 2x2 diagram that I created for this. I'm going to share the screen again here. So yeah, right. The big, I think when you're talking about this top-down approach, and I appreciate your comments, they were fantastic, and definitely I want to hit on this translatability that you were talking about earlier as well. But as far as that top-down approach, right? I created this 2x2 because it kind of goes into this theory of pernicious racism, this idea that you have folks who are not, it's not just this idea that the system is racist. And there are definite examples of how the system is racist and how it's pegged against us, right? And we have a lot of theories and a lot of evidence to showcase that. But what seems to have been forgotten, or what seems to not get addressed as often, is this rise, or this increase of pernicious racism, this racism that's very intentional, not just, hey, Black folks were discriminated against for centuries, and then, you know, we just said, oh, we're going to stop discrimination, and then obviously we're not going to fuel any funds into these communities, so they're going to continue this cycle, right? Which is something that definitely happens, and we definitely still need to address it because it continues to this day. But this is more saying, hey, depending on the opportunity structures that are in place, people will engage in various levels of racism. Like, there are people who still don't like Black people, and there are people who still will target Black people, right? And one of the biggest evidence that I use for this is I talk about Wells Fargo, right? Wells Fargo, before the Great Recession, they had these loan officers that were targeting Black people. They were calling Black people mud people, right? They were calling Black people mud people. And then they were going and giving them these mortgages that were going to explode in their face. And in order to get them to take these Wells Fargo loan officers were actually going into the Black church because they knew that Black folks would listen to the Black church leaders, and convincing them to convince their membership that, hey, you should take on these horrible loans that would obviously devastate us in a few years later once the Great Recession hit, right? And that's why we're disparately impacted. Similarly, the largest redlining settlement in history did not happen years and years ago. It happened in 2015 with Hudson City Savings Bank, right? These are intentional actors, right? But the reason that they were able to be successful for as long as they were in discriminating against Black people, right, is because of this idea that they were operating their racism under the visible surface, right? They were moving perniciously. And that's why here you'll see that I have it's a 2x2, right? So I have two dimensions of this. But the first one is, if you have an institution that has high institutional oversight versus an institution that has low institutional oversight, right? Obviously, if you have checks in place in an institution that are going to pull up red flags whenever somebody discriminates, right? That's going to be a place where, hey, you're going to be able to prevent pernicious racism, right? Because people are, if they try to engage in it, they're going to get caught, right? And nobody really wants to get caught in this day and age, right? It's not as overt. Similarly, on this side, we actually have to look at the actors in the institutions, right? I call them the administrators. For example, in my analysis, the judges would be the administrators, right? And these actors here, right, they actually are, if they have a personal idea or a personal ideology of the government having a hands-on approach, right, then they're going to be active in making sure that discrimination is not happening, right? And that's why here you see the biggest threat to pernicious racism is having a place that has high institutional oversight and administrators that also want to ensure that the government is implementing its role as preventing discrimination. But once you move away from that, you start to see varying levels of pernicious racism, such as if there are low institutional oversights built in, even if you have actors, like, for example, if you have a state that does not have judicial foreclosure laws, that lenders don't have to go through the judiciary, right? You can have great judges, like in California, that would want the government to step in and fight discrimination. But if the institution has an embedded low institutional oversight, then there's not going to be, you're still going to experience pernicious racism, right? And that's kind of what we're looking at here, is saying that both the administrators and the institution have to be on the same page if you want to fight discrimination. And if not, you open the door to this pernicious racism. And that's kind of going into that top-down approach that you were talking about before.
There I go. I did it. I forgot to unmute myself. No, excellent. Excellent explanation. Anybody else want to jump in? If not, I have one last question for you. Just looking at the overall impact of this issue, I guess, what do you think has more of an impact? The fact that states have judicial foreclosure laws, or the political parties that are in charge within that state?
So which has more of an impact? That's a good question. It's like saying which of this 2x2 has weighs more, I guess. I want to initially, I think I'm going to have to go with, I don't know if it's the safe answer. I think it really is the right answer to say that they are equal, to the extent that, just like in California, you saw really significant penalties on Black home ownership, right? And if you look at Republican districts where they do have to go through judiciaries, you see a similar and significant impact on Black home ownership. I guess if we wanted to, we could weigh the difference of that penalty, right? And see how different they are. And you'd probably come out that the party was more important than the institutional setting in that sense, because really it's the administrators have to have the ideology that the government's job is to intervene. If the administrator doesn't have that ideology, then there's a lot more room to back away, right? And so I think, but more all in all, and especially as we take this, transfer it to other fields, right? It's going to have to be the institution as well as the administrators that make this work. So I'm going to go ahead and say equal.
Yes, no, great, absolutely great. And like as I told you, I work in the field of educational policy and criminal justice, and so I'm definitely, you giving me some ideas on how to sort of look at certain issues that I research, and I'm sure others will be able to also take that approach. So definitely want to give a big thank you to Kendrick for that wonderful presentation. It was awesome. And I guess if we have no further comments, we may be able to actually get out a little bit early. And if you want to go join another session, you'll have some time to do it. But if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Kendrick or myself, and we will be happy to, I will be happy to put you in touch with him or the other presenters from today. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you all. Great presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. And thank you